Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Sahabuddin Ahamad, Assistant Professor Guest Faculty in the Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Bilaspur, Chhattisgarh. Welcome you all to this virtual lecture. Today I will discuss the topic Can the Subaltern Speak? An Analytical Overview. To begin with, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak is a leading figure in the post-colonial studies. Spivak was born in Calcutta in 1942. She educated in both India and the United States of America. Later, she became an academic in the United States of America. Spivak is known for her translation of Jacques Derrida's of Grammatology. This work introduced deconstruction to an English-speaking audience. Consequently, her work reflects a strong engagement with Marxism, feminism, post-colonialism, and post-structuralism. Spivak's most important essay, seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, was first published in 1988, and this essay is one of the founding texts of post-colonial studies. In this work, Spivak critically examines whether marginalized groups in post-colonial societies are able to express their voices within dominant power sociocultural structures. Spivak claims that local educators, officials, and other Western scholars never faithfully speak for subaltern people. Moreover, her work engages deeply with the issues of voice, power, representation, and knowledge production in post-colonial studies. In this lecture, I will discuss the key concept of the subaltern, Spivak's critique of Foucault and Deleuze, the problem of representation, the example of Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, Spivak's critique of Western feminism and Marxism, the ethical responsibility of intellectuals, and contemporary relevance and conclusion. Now, in this slide, introduction to the subaltern concept, I'd like to discuss the term subaltern. The term subaltern, originally used by the Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci used the term to describe group of people who are socially, politically, and economically marginalized, oppressed proletariat people. The term includes colonized subjects, workers, women, and the oppressed poor people, and they are systematically excluded from decision making hegemonic power structures, and marginalized are not represented in dominant cultural narratives, political narratives. Marginalized do not control institutions like government, media, education, or religion. Because of this, their voices are often ignored, erased, misrepresented, devalued. Gramsci was interested in how powerful groups, that is, elite class or ruling class, maintain control not just through force but through ideas and culture, that is called knowledge production or discourse. According to Gramsci, the ruling class spreads its values and beliefs in such a way that they become accepted as common sense in our society. Consequently, marginalized groups may not realize how they are being silenced or controlled. Continued, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak expands the concept subaltern further. Spivak means the subaltern, the third world women, silenced, suppressed, oppressed, marginalized, who are marginalized economically, socially, culturally, politically. Spivak focuses on the subaltern in the context of colonialism and patriarchy. She asks a question, can the subaltern speak? She raises question how the independent agency voice of the subaltern people is suppressed by the powerful in society. What she means is, can the most marginalized people express themselves in a system that constantly silences them? She argues that some groups, particularly third women, face multiple layers of suppression by colonial power and by patriarchy within their own society and by global capitalism. In this way, third world women are doubly oppressed. Third world women are ignored. They are often spoken for by others, Western scholars. When someone tries to represent them, the true experiences are often distorted. Because of these factors, their voices unheard in Western dominant discourse. This essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, has become very important in post-colonial studies and critical theory because it challenges us to rethink ideas like who has the right to speak, who is allowed to represent others, can subaltern people truly express themselves within dominant socio-cultural structure, systems, discourse. Now moving to the next slide, post-structuralist context, Foucault and Deleuze. In this slide, my focus is on how Spivak critiques Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze for developing post-structuralist frameworks about power, knowledge, and discourse. And these frameworks ignore crucial ideological context, historical context. According to Foucault, power does not only exist in institution or government. Instead, power works through networks such as school, hospital, prisons, media, and system of knowledge. Foucault calls this relationship between power and knowledge, meaning knowledge and power are interconnected. Knowledge is a form of power. Both are entangled. Spivak believes that their concepts are influential, but they are too abstract because Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze do not pay attention to subaltern agency in relation to colonial history, imperialism, and geopolitical realities. Continued from the previous slide, Spivak also talks about intellectual complicity. She says that many Western scholars fail to recognize their own role in maintaining system of dominance. She exposes how they criticize oppression, but they do not question their own position within dominant power structures. They assume their ideas that are universal and applicable everywhere. They inadvertently erase the specific experience of colonized people, subaltern people. So that's why Spivak critiques Western scholars and local elites, educators, officials, that is their intellectual complicity regarding the experience of subaltern people. Continued from the previous slide, Foucault and Deleuze sometimes suggest that oppressed people can speak for themselves. They can resist power through discourse. But Spivak challenges this optimism. She argues that how colonial structures constrain ability of the subaltern subjects. That's why they can't represent themselves. Their voices are unheard in dominant discourse. Even if subaltern people try to speak, their voices are often misrepresented. Their voices are absorbed, appropriated by dominant frameworks. Next slide. Epistemic violence and Western intellectuals. Now let us come to a key term, epistemic violence. Epistemic violence refers to the imposition of a given set of beliefs over another. The term epistemic violence refers to the process by which Western system of knowledge impose their own ways of understanding the world, and their worldviews silence, erase, suppress subaltern voices, and dismiss indigenous knowledge system by calling them inferior or primitive or backward. Continued from the previous slide. During colonial rule, Western thought was presented as rational, superior, modern, scientific, and universal, while indigenous epistemologies were labeled as primitive. This is a form of violence, according to Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, because it erases cultures, histories, voices of colonized people, subaltern people without using physical force. They are misunderstood, misrepresented, dehumanized through dominant discursive practices. Continued. Spivak also critiques well-intentioned Western scholars who try to help subaltern people. She critiques because she notices how they are speaking on behalf of the subaltern people, but they can't create a space for subaltern people to speak, to represent themselves in dominant discourse. Moreover, Western scholars romanticize and essentialize the oppressed other, the subaltern people. Even with good intention, this continues the pattern of silencing. The subaltern remains an object of discussion rather than an active subject. This is why Spivak wants us to be careful about representation, and she questions who is speaking and who is being spoken for. Continued. Spivak gives the example of the British abolition of sati in India. The British presented their intervention as humanitarian and civilized. They attempted to themselves civilized, superior through the abolition of the widow sacrifice in colonial India. They claimed that they were saving Indian women from barbaric customs, that is, widow sacrifice. However, Spivak argues that this situation was more complex. Indian women themselves were not allowed to speak about their experiences. In this process, the colonial state actually silenced Indian women while justifying its role. Now, coming to the slide, the problem of representation. Spivak explains that the word representation has two different meanings in German. Darstellung Presentation. Darstellung means representation in an aesthetic and philosophical sense. It refers to how something is described, how something is portrayed. The second one is Vertretung. This means political representation. Political representation or speaking on behalf of someone else. Spivak says both forms involve power. How subaltern voices are silenced within existing means of representation. Subalterns are represented by others, and such representation is questionable because when someone represents another person, whether through writing, politics, or theory, the original voice is never fully represented or preserved. And this representation is always filtered, shaped, transformed by the person doing the representing. And such a representation is not neutral. That's why Spivak questions, because such representation always includes mediation and power dynamics. It excludes marginalized people in cultural presentation, political representation. Continued from the previous slide, Spivak argues that subalterns cannot simply speak in a direct way within dominant discourse without their words being appropriated or distorted through the lens of hegemonic knowledge systems. Attempts to represent subaltern voices risk diverse complex experiences into monolithic narratives, and this serves Western understanding rather than capturing authentic subaltern subjectivity. What Spivak actually wants to say is that how subaltern cannot speak because their voices are misrepresented, their voices are erased through the lens of dominant knowledge system. And she also says that though many attempts are made to represent subaltern voices, but such representation is monolithic representation, and such monolithic representation serves the Western purposes rather than capturing the authentic experiences of the subaltern voice, subaltern people, subaltern subjectivity. So that's why the act of representation becomes a site of epistemic violence even when undertaken with the best intention. Though some scholars with good intention attempt to represent subaltern voices, but their representation is questionable because their representation is a site of epistemic violence due to uneven cultural representation and power dynamics. Now turning on to the slide, the case of Bhubaneswari Bhaduri. To illustrate her argument clearly, Spivak discusses the practice of Sati widow sacrifice, where Indian widows were expected to immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyres. On one hand, British colonial authorities portrayed themselves as saviors of Indian women. On the other hand, Indian patriarchal tradition justified the widow sacrifice practice. However, in both narratives, the women is never heard. The subaltern women remains completely silenced. Spivak interrogates British colonial authorities and Indian patriarchal traditions, how both traditions silence, oppress, dehumanize women, and in this way subaltern women remains completely silenced. She provides an example, that is the sacrifice of Bhubaneswari Bhaduri. Bhubaneswari Bhaduri, an Indian woman, she involved in anti-colonial revolutionary politics. She committed suicide during menstruation. It is a deliberate temporal choice that prevented her death from being misread as Sati. She was sending a message through her suicide that her act was political, not personal. Her act was to racist both Western colonial narrative that portrayed Indian women as helpless victims. Her act was to resist Indian nationalist narratives that would appropriate her story for political purposes. Bhubaneswari Bhaduri tried to assert her agency within very limited oppressive condition. Her message was not understood because her family interpreted her death as related to personal issues, not political resistance. Even when a subaltern women make a deliberate political choice, their voice may still not be heard correctly. This case demonstrates how subaltern subjectivity exists in a space of dislocation and impossibility rather than a clear, coherent, unified voice. Now moving to Spivak's critique of Western feminism and Marxism. Spivak argues that many Western feminists assume that women everywhere share the same kind of oppression. This is called Western feminist universalism. Western feminists universalize women's experience across the world. They project their own liberation narratives onto third world women. But their project ignores colonial histories, economic condition, cultural difference, global power inequalities. They ignore how these intersected. They ignore how this intersectionality affects the lives of third world women. That's why Spivak critiques Western feminist universalism. Spivak also critiques traditional Marxism. Marxism focuses mainly on class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. According to Spivak, this is important, but this is not enough because it does not fully address colonial context, colonial domination, racial hierarchies, gender oppression, global division of labor, and the heterogeneity of subaltern experiences. So that's why Spivak critiques traditional Marxism because Marxism is confined to class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. Because of these limitations, Spivak calls for contextual and specific analysis. She encourages scholars to pay attention to history and geography to recognize intersectionality that highly affects subaltern lives. She encourages scholars, readers to avoid universal assumptions regarding the subaltern people. She encourages readers to remain critically aware of their own position. Now, in this slide, intellectuals' role and ethical responsibility. Spivak says that intellectuals must act with ethical responsibility. They must recognize their own position within power structure. This means where they are located socially and what privilege they have and how they have benefit from system of power, how they have benefit privilege from their position, power, knowledge production systems. For example, Western scholars often work within institutions, and such institutions are shaped by colonial ideology, colonial histories, colonial assumptions. If they ignore this, they may unknowingly repeat hegemonic patterns. Spivak insists that we acknowledge our own complicity in knowledge production and hegemonic discourse. So, instead of speaking for the subalterns, intellectuals should work to create a space where subalterns can articulate their own voices, experiences. That is to say, dismantling challenging structural barriers encouraging collaborative work, listening more than speaking. Spivak also emphasizes that theory alone is not enough. Intellectual work must connect to real political engagement, political commitment. Scholars should support subaltern struggles without romanticizing them, without using them for academic recognition, without appropriating their experiences. That means scholars should subaltern struggles, contemporary relevance and critics. Why Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, has become one of the most influential essay in post-colonial theory because it challenges scholars to question their own authority. It challenges scholars to question their privileged position when discussing marginalized people. Moreover, Spivak's essay emphasizes the ethical responsibility of the intellectuals, scholars, educators to recognize the limits of cultural political representation. It emphasizes the ethical responsibility of the readers, writers, authors, educators to avoid universalism. Spivak's ideas have been applied to diverse contemporary issues such as indigenous rights movements, refugee narratives, digital activism, and decolonial scholarship. Continued from the previous slide. However, many scholars criticize Spivak's theory. Scholars argue that her claim the subaltern cannot speak sounds too pessimistic, and some scholars fear that Spivak's theory may lead to political paralysis. Another criticism is that her writing is highly theoretical, complex, and dense text. For activists working directly with marginalized communities, her arguments may be difficult to apply practically. So that's why many scholars criticize Spivak's theory. Even today, her essay continues to create debates about solidarity, collaborative knowledge production, power difference in activism. These debates show that her work is still intellectually alive and relevant. Now I will conclude with Spivak's final position. Spivak's answer to the question, Can the Subaltern Speak, is deliberately complex. She does not mean that subaltern people are literally silent. She means that how within dominant discourses, subaltern voices are appropriated, misrepresented, suppressed, silenced. So in that sense, subaltern cannot fully speak on their own terms. In other words, subalterns cannot speak not in the terms of they are silent, but in the terms of suppression, dehumanization, misrepresentation, because their voices are suppressed. However, acknowledging this structural silence is important. Instead of pretending we are giving voice to the marginalized, we must acknowledge the systems that prevent authentic speech. Spivak acknowledged the structural silence, how structural silence operates in dominant discourse. Instead of pretending that we are giving voice to the marginalized, we must acknowledge the systems that suppressed, silent, subaltern voice, authentic speech. We must acknowledge the systems that erase, suppress, ignore subaltern voice. And this recognition becomes the first step toward ethical engagement and decolonial knowledge production. And through these steps, subaltern people can be empowered, they can be heard. Spivak calls for constant vigilance against epistemic violence. She reminds us that representation has not withered. Power still shapes whose voices are heard globally. There is no virtue in simply making global list about women without understanding context. Can the subaltern speak is not just a theoretical question. According to Spivak, can the subaltern speak is a challenge to all of us, especially intellectuals, writers, officials, educators, to rethink power, voice, representation, and our role within global systems of inequality. Now I have completed the topic. I hope this presentation has provided you useful insight. I welcome any question, comments from you. That's all for today's session. We'll meet again with another video. Thank you for watching and engagement.